Hi there, my name is Andy Croft and I pastor a church called Soul Survivor in Watford. And welcome back to God Speaks Today. What we do on this show is we take a passage of scripture and we believe that God will speak to us through that passage, then we listen and we hear what he says. We're going to come to the passage in a minute, but I just wanted to start by saying I want to talk about today, how do we become friends of God? And one of the reasons why I want to talk about that is because I have come across, this happens to me every now and then, maybe you can relate to it, I come across people that they just seem to know Jesus in a way that I don't, but I want to. I remember I was listening to the Archbishop of York, John Sentiment, one time. I was just in a crowd of people listening to him speak, and someone asked a question, and they said something about, do you believe, or something like, how do you know belief isn't a risk, or something like that. And then Sentiment just stood up and he said, for me, belief is risk, but I am a prisoner of a God who stopped me, embraced me, and kissed me. And I remember the way that he said it, you could just tell he had this relationship with the living God. There was a time, I still remember it, it won't sound like much, but I still remember it. I was at this wedding and they got an old lady to pray for the couple that were getting married, and she stood up and she just went off on this prayer. And I remember she used all sorts of bizarre nautical imagery. She might have been a sailor back in the day, but she just went off on it, and I could just it felt like the presence of God just filled the room, almost as because she was talking to him like he was a friend. And I still meet people every now and then. It's just there's something about the way that they are. You can tell they know God really, really well. And I want that. And so what we want to look at is, how do we get there? How do we grow in friendship with God? All of us are God's children, but I'm not sure that we can say in the same way that all of us know him as a really close friend. Abraham is the way that we're going to go. And if you have a Bible with you, you might want to just turn to the passages with me, but we're going to hop around initially. One of the names that God gives Abraham is my friend. And if you want God to give you any sort of title, you want anything written on your gravestone at the end of your life, to be called a friend of God, I can't think of anything better. In Isaiah chapter 41, verse 8, God calls Abraham my friend. And then James picks up on this in his letter, James 2, verse 23, of Abraham it says, and he was called God's friend. So he's our example. What's going to be the way to friendship with God, do you think? Jesus says it really, really clearly, and he says it in John chapter 15, verse 14. He says, you are my friends if you do what I command. You are my friends if you do what I command. Now, there's no one else where that's how friendship works in the same way. Can you imagine if you turn to your mate, in the pub or something, you say, you are my friend if you do exactly what I tell you. It doesn't work like that, but with God, that is the way relationship with him works. So he is our Savior, and he rescues us, and we are saved by grace and by nothing else. But then he invites us into relationship. He beckons us into friendship, and the way to friendship is the way of obedience. And Abraham is someone who managed that. How did he get there? What's the journey that he went on? Well, if you have a Bible, why don't you flick it open with me to Genesis chapter 12. This is when God appears to Abraham. He's called Abram at the start of the story, but God appears to him, and it says in Genesis chapter 12, verse 1, the Lord had said to Abram, go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse, and all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you. That's the first encounter between God and this man who becomes his friend. And what God says to Abraham there is, leave everything you know, and come away and follow me. And as you do that, you will receive a blessing. I am going to make you the father of many. Children up and down the world are going to be singing in Sunday school, Father Abraham has many sons has Father Abraham, because you're going to have so many kids, it's going to be incredible. Abraham is 75 at that point and childless. His wife is also very old and childless, Sarah. And so they begin to wait for God to fulfill this promise. And years go by, and nothing happens. And Abraham has some ups and he has some downs. And there's a time again in Genesis chapter 15, which is years later, Abraham's just really doubting God's promise. And he says to God, what can you give me? And God takes him outside the tent. It's nighttime. And he says, look up at the stars, Abraham. count them if you can. I tell you, you will have more descendants than there are stars in the sky, than there are grains of sand on the seashore. Honestly, Abraham, children in churches around the world will be singing, Father Abraham has many sons has Father Abraham. Years and years and years go by, and still they don't have a kid. And eventually Abraham takes it into his own hands, and he sleeps with Hagar, who's Sarah, his wife's servant. They have a child together called Ishmael, but that's not the fulfillment of the promise, because it's not born of Sarah, this child. And God comes again, and this time he changes his name from Abram to Abraham, which means father of many. It's almost a bigger thing. Father Abraham has many sons as father. I promise you, Abraham, this is going to happen. And then finally, when Abraham is 100 years old and his wife Sarah is 90, can you imagine a 90-year-old pregnant woman? That's all kinds of weird. But like Abraham and Sarah, they finally have a kid, and they call him Isaac, which means laughter, but almost just because they're so overcome at the ridiculous goodness of God to them. And that's the point where you would expect, if this was a Disney story, at that point, you would expect it to say, and they lived happily ever after. You know, Abraham's loaded, he's finally got the son of promise. You would expect it just kind of the sun sets and they live happily ever after. That's not what happens. If you have a Bible, turn with me, Genesis chapter 22. This is what we read. Verse 1. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham, here I am, he replied. Then God said, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you. Early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey, and then he heads off to do what God has commanded. Abraham, hey, Abraham. Yes, God? You know your son? Yes, God? You know your only son, Isaac? Yes, God? You know the one that you love? Yes, God? Kill him for me, would you? Kill him for me, would you? That's what God asks of Abraham. If you haven't read the story, just to fill in the end, God stops Abraham at the last minute from following through this command. But Abraham doesn't know he's going to do that at the time. And so that's what God says to Abraham. And it says in verse 3, we just read it, early the next morning, Abraham gets up. And when you get up early, it's because you've made your mind up and you're going to do it, you know. He gets up early to do this, to fulfill God's command, and goes off to do it. But my question is what happened in the night. Can you imagine what that must have been like as Abraham sat in his tent that night, trying to figure out, do I obey God? And we talk about how friendship comes from obedience, but obedience isn't straightforward. And I think if I was Abraham, there would have been at least 3 reasons, I want to go through these, 3 reasons why not to obey God. Reason number 1, this is something that occurs to all of us, I'm sure, at some point. Reason number 1 why not to obey God. Because God sounds like he's crazy. You want me to do what, God? You want me to kill who now? Isaac, the son of promise, who I've just been waiting for 25 years for. How is that going to work? Father Abraham had a son called Isaac, and then he killed him. It's not a very nice Sunday school song. How's that going to sound? And so often God says things to us, and we hear them. I hear them, and I think, I really don't think that makes any sense. That makes no rational sense to me, God. And yet, if we look at the God of the Bible, we look at what God tells people to do, all the way through the scripture, so often it mustn't have made very much sense to them. So let's take a few examples. Noah. Hey, Noah. Yes, God? Build a boat. I live in a desert. Yes. Build a massive boat and then put loads and loads of animals in. Okay. Moses, there's this bit at the end in Exodus where they've just escaped from Egypt and the plagues have happened and they come to the Red Sea and they've got this army chasing them of Egyptians. And at that point, Moses cries out to God for help. And, you would have thought Moses would be like, okay, God, give us some serious help. And then God says, okay, Moses, we're going to help you out here. Take a stick and then take the stick and then hold it over the sea. Really, God? Do you think we've got time for holding sticks over the sea? I'll tell you what, some machine guns or something, some sort of chariots would help us here. No, take a stick and then hold it over the sea. Joshua also learned that God's battle plans didn't always seem to make very much sense. He's attacking Jericho, big walls. And he says to God, well, maybe he did. I imagine him saying to God, so, how do you think we should do this? Or do you think some catapults would work? And then God says, no, Joshua, I've got a great idea. Let's get out the trumpets. Get some trumpets, get some worship leaders, and then what I want you to do is walk around the walls of Jericho 7 times singing some songs to me. We could go on. The prophets. Have you ever read the prophets? There's some mental stuff in the prophets. Isaiah. God, no one ever takes your prophets seriously. No one's listening to anything I'm saying. So do you know what God tells Isaiah to do? I've got a great idea, Isaiah. This is in Isaiah chapter 20. Why don't you take off all your clothes? Really, Lord? You want me to take all my clothes off? You think that's going to help me preach your message? Yes, take them all off and then leave them off for 3 years. Hosea, I've had a great idea. What I want you to do is marry a prostitute. You want me to marry a what? Marry a prostitute, marry someone who's definitely, completely and utterly going to have an affair and destroy your heart, and then go and have a nice honeymoon. Ezekiel, I've got a brilliant idea. What I want you to do is lie down on your left side. Really, Lord? How long for? Oh, I think about 390 days should do it, Ezekiel. So Ezekiel lies down on his left side for 390 days. And it goes on, and it goes on, and it goes on. So much of what God commands these people to do, it doesn't make sense. And there is a point to it. So it wasn't that 390 days later, God was like, oh my word, Ezekiel, I can't believe you just did that. There was a point that God was making through Ezekiel and through his lying down. There was a point he was making through Isaiah, but do you think they knew it at the time? Do you think Noah had ever seen rain fall in a desert? Do you think Moses had ever seen a sea part when someone held a stick over it? Do you think Joshua had ever seen worship bring down walls? They didn't know how it was going to end, and they had no way of knowing. But what they did is they obeyed the command of God. And so often when God speaks to us, he will sound like he's crazy. And we don't have to look in the Old Testament to find that. There's some stuff in the New Testament. Let me give you one. Love your enemies, Jesus says. Really? Does that make sense? I remember hearing a well-known atheist, Christopher Hitchens, talking about what a ridiculous command that was. He said, I don't want to love my enemies, I want to kill my enemies. And that makes sense if they're your enemy. But Jesus says, love your enemies. That's something that can be easy until you have an enemy, and then it becomes a little bit hard. I remember when I was walking down my street one time back in Watford, and this guy, this doesn't happen to me very much, but this guy came out of a house, and he just came up and just started on me for no reason. He was just really angry. He just started trying to have a fight with me, and I'm not very hard. And so I didn't really know what to do, but I kind of backed down and just walked off and felt humiliated. And then I remember the moment I left him, just feeling so angry. And I started to say all these things that I wish I'd said to him, to myself. And I remember going home. Maybe I'm the only person in the world that does this, but I don't think so. Going home in my bedroom. And when I was in my bedroom, man, I was really hard. I mean, I said all this stuff I wish I'd said to him when I was there in my bedroom in front of the mirror. I was super hard. And I didn't want to forgive this guy. I didn't want to love him. I was so hurt. I was so angry. I wanted to take a brick and I wanted to throw it through his window. And at that point, the command to love an enemy doesn't make sense. There will be so many things that God asks of me and of you that we will not understand. And what we're invited into is a relationship of trust, a relationship of faith. If we only ever obey the commands of God that make rational, perfect sense to us, then it's never faith. Abraham sat in his tent that night and he thought, flip, God, you sound like you're crazy. But if I know my God, reason number 2 that must have occurred to him as he sat there in the tent, God, this is really going to hurt someone that I love. In this case, Isaac. Isn't that something that often we say, well, God, I want to do this, but this is going to hurt people that I love, people who I care about? I like to think that if God called me to go to live in some incredibly difficult place, I could go, but I'm married now and I've got a baby. And so suddenly it's become a lot more real. How could I take them there? What's that about, God? And Jesus says, and it's a hard thing for us to hear, but Jesus says in Matthew, let me find the passage. Matthew chapter 5, verse 44. Anyone who loves his father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Anyone who loves his son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me." And you hear those words and they sound so harsh, but the way that this relationship works is he has to come first. He's the king, we're the servant. His commands come before anyone and anything. And I'm not saying that God's going to call us to abandon our families. That's not how God works. We can miss the goodness of that command because it sounds so strong. What he's saying is you have to put me first. And what I find is when I put him first, I become a better husband. I become a better father when he's number one. But so often we can allow other people to intervene. I remember reading a book. It's about a guy called Rees Howes. It's called Rees Howes Intercessor. And he was around about 100 years ago. He was a coal miner, and he got to know God incredibly well. One of the things he and his wife had always wanted to do is they'd always wanted to have a baby, and they just couldn't have kids. And they prayed and they prayed and they prayed, and eventually they managed to get pregnant. And just when they got pregnant, they really strongly heard God speak to them. And God said to them, "I want you to go as a missionary to a part of Africa." And they knew that to take their child there would be like a death sentence for the kid. This was before they had anti-malaria medication and any of that stuff. And so they knew if they were going to be obedient and go, they would have to leave their son behind. And it was agony for them, but in the end they decided to obey. And I've got questions about this, but they gave their child to their closest friends. And it describes this scene where they're on a dock and they're getting on a boat and they're weeping as they look at their baby son in the arms of this other couple, and they leave in order to be obedient to God. Now, whether we understand that or not, that principle of obedience is something that applies to us. And as it happens, years later, Rees Howes came back to Wales, which is where he was from, and he started a Bible college. And do you know who became his kind of vice principal as he ran the Bible college? His son. And father and son ended up working together and doing ministry together. And it was the son that took the college on after Rees Howes gave it up and died. In there, you see, I think, an example of obedience that for us we're called to put God before anyone and anything. And when we do that, actually, we become better at being friends, better at being husbands, and all the rest. Abraham sat in his tent that night and thought, this is really going to hurt someone that I love. But I love you supremely, God, and so I know I'm called to obey you. And then I imagine the final thing, as he sat there in his tent at night, he must have thought, what's in it for me? All I can see here is a cost. And see, when God first called Abraham, back in Genesis 12, he says, leave everything, Abraham, but there's a blessing here, which is if you leave everything else, you will get blessed. You're going to, Father Abraham has many sons. I'm going to, you're going to have all these blessings. And so there's this phrase that's get yourself, that's used in that particular bit in Genesis 12 as get yourself away from this place, Abraham, to another place. The only other place that particular Hebrew word comes in the whole of the Bible, and when the Bible does this, it's saying something to us. The only place that particular phrase comes in the whole of the Bible is Genesis chapter 22, the other passage that we read, when it says, get yourself, Abraham, to the region of Moriah and sacrifice Isaac. And you see, the first time, it's like leave everything, but you get the blessing. The second time, it's literally kill the blessing. There's nothing in this for you. This is what you've waited 25 years for, and now I'm asking you to put this on the altar and to kill it. And surely, if you're Abraham, you're thinking, there is only a downside to this. There is no benefit in this for me whatsoever. And what God does for those of us who want to be his friends is he draws us and invites us into a relationship of obedience. And at the start, when you come to know God, it's like, oh yeah, come to know me and you'll find eternal life and you'll find peace and you find all of these things, and you do. But there are moments where he then begins to say to you, do this just because I'm asking you to. Not because there's a blessing, not because there's like a secret thing, you put the coin in the slot and you pull it and you get 10 times. I'm just asking you to do this and I just want you to do it. And often, when we do that, all we can see is the cost, and all we can see, as it were, is the cross. But Jesus invites us to follow him and carry our cross. Sometimes what happens is you do those things and you step out in obedience, and then you find out years later what the result of that was. Not always, but sometimes. And I remember my friend Mike Padavacci, who also is doing some stuff on TBN, he told me a story about how years and years ago, about 20 years ago, he went off to Finland to do a camp, Christian camp there. And in the course of the camp, he got to know this guy who was about 15 years old. He went and sat on him, and sat on a bench, didn't sit on him, sat on a bench with him, and had conversations with him about his family. This guy had a tough background, tough family life. And Mike tells the story, and he said the third time they went and sat on this bench, it was a bit chilly because it was Finland, and this guy was shivering, and so Mike just took his jumper off. And Mike's quite a big guy. He took his jumper off and gave him this jumper, and the guy sat there nice and warm in the jumper. And then at the end of the conversation, Mike felt like God said to him, "Give him the jumper." And Mike says his initial response was, "No, it's my jumper. I like that jumper. It's my favorite jumper." And the Lord said, "Give him the jumper." And so eventually Mike said, when this guy, Timo, who was his name, he said, "You know, you can have your jumper back." Mike said, "Oh, don't worry, mate. You keep it." Then Mike came back to England. A little while ago, 2 or 3 years ago, he went back to Finland. This is about 20 years after that conference, to do another conference. And there was a guy who was translating for Mike all the way through this conference. And then on the final day, he said to Mike, "Would you mind if I get up and say something just before you speak?" And Mike thought, that's a little bit weird. That's not how translation's meant to work. I speak, you translate, but okay. All the way through this conference, this guy had been showing Mike photos of his family and all this stuff. Anyway, and then the translator got up and he said, "Mike doesn't remember me, but about 16 years ago, he came and did a conference in Finland. And for 3 afternoons, he took me out and we sat on a bench together and I talked to him about my dad and some of my stuff. And then at the end of it, he gave me a jumper. And I know it sounds crazy, but that was the first time anyone had ever given me anything, and it meant the world." And he said, from that, I said to Mike I'd never get married, but as a result of our conversations, I began to soften, and eventually I got married. And I now have 2 beautiful daughters. And then he reached down and he pulled, it's absolutely true, he pulled out a carry bag. And in the carry bag, he lifted out the jumper that Mike had given him all those years ago. And he said, "I just wanted to say to you, thank you. And you can have the jumper back now. It's done its job. It's done its job." Mike had no idea that that was what was going on. So often, you won't know. When God says, do this, you won't know the fruit. And often you don't see the fruit. All you see is the cost. But when you obey, that's when he's able to use you. And that's where he's able to work through you. And I have my own struggles with this. I remember a little while ago, I was trying to learn how to pray for people a bit better and hear God speak and have words for people and stuff like that. And I took a little break. This was when I was studying at university. I had a half-hour lunch break. And I thought, all right, I'm going to go out from my studies. I'm going to stand in this particular area that I knew, and I'm going to pray that God would speak to me, give me a word, and that I would go and give it to somebody else, and they would become a Christian. I thought it was going to be that simple. And so I went and stood underneath this tree in this bit of area of grass. It was near a river, and there was a path there. And I said, "God, send someone along this path. Give me a word for them. I will pray for them. They will become a Christian." And the moment I said that, I felt like God said to me, if someone in a red coat comes along, you're to pray for them. And so immediately, I started to get worried that someone in a red coat was actually going to come along. And I remember, I don't know if a busload of people in red coats got off around the corner, but suddenly it felt like everyone had red coats. And people would walk towards, and my thing with God was this particular bit of path. They would walk towards my bit of path, and then they would walk away just at the key moment. So it felt like I was on this emotional roller coaster. And then eventually I saw this woman, this old woman hobbling along, wearing a coat that was questionably red. And so I had this whole debate about, is that red? Is that not red? I don't even know. And then eventually I said, fine, it's red, it's red, it's red. Then I thought, do I go pray for her? And I'm weighing up the pros and cons in my head. So I'm thinking, on a plus side, you know, there are worse people you could pray for. She's an old woman. You know, if it all goes wrong, I'll just push her in the river and run away. And then I'm thinking, on the other hand, she's still a person, so it's still going to be humiliating. And I had this debate as she hobbled towards me. And then she hobbled past me. And then she hobbled away. And I didn't do it. And I remember walking back to my room, feeling gutted with myself. Just feeling like, Andy, you can't even go and pray for this old woman. What sort of a Christian are you? And of course, God responded with kindness. Of course, he responded with mercy. But if we're never able to step out, we miss something that we're invited into. We miss friendship. And over the years, there have been maybe just a few times where I feel like I've managed to really step out. And what I've experienced in those moments, and it's something for all of us, is a new sense of intimacy with God. I remember there was one time when I was just chatting about this stuff with God, and I was due to speak at something that we run at our church in Watford. And I said to God in the morning, I've got to write the talk today. I got up at 5 in the morning. I'm a total perfectionist. And I got up at 5 in the morning. I was speaking at 5 o'clock that night. I thought, I'm just going to blitz this. And I said to God early that morning, how can I trust you today? How can I depend on you today? And his response to me was, well, Andy, what I'd love you to do is to not prepare this talk until about like an hour and a half, 2 hours before the meeting. And that for me is a huge deal. And my response to God was, okay, fine, on this occasion. And then I went back to my house, because I've been praying in a park near where I live. I went back to my house and I spent the entire morning banging my head off a wall in faith. And then I sat down with a blank piece of paper 2 hours before I was meant to speak, and I said, you had seriously better come through now, Lord, because there's going to be loads of people there and I've got nothing to say. And I remember scribbling some thoughts down, going down, giving the talk. And the talk wasn't a disaster. It went, I'm not saying it was incredible, but it went all right. And then walking home, and if you'd seen me when I was walking home, if you'd seen the smile on my face, you would have thought I just knocked it out the park. And I hadn't. But what I had found, what I had experienced, is in that moment when I stood there with that microphone and I didn't really know where I was going to go, and there was all those people, it was like, well, it's me and you here, Lord. It's me and you. And you better help me out. And there was a closeness and there was a friendship. Sometimes all you see is the cost, and you don't always know what the fruit was. But what always comes out of it is intimacy with God. How do you be his friend? You choose to obey him. He might sound like he's crazy. You might think, oh my word, this is going to hurt someone that I really care about if I do this. And you might think, all I can see is a cost. Do it anyway. And we grow as his friends. Thanks for watching. See you next time on God Speaks Today.